Welcome back, Ian Weeks. This is Ian Weeks with Soft. I'll give him a minute to introduce him and everything that he does. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a developer of Pedra Crystal Caves, which is on Atari VCS, and general code monkey extraordinaire.
Old Monkey Extraordinaire. And I am Kazdan Azam with Crash Productions, and I have no idea about anything involving coding, but I'm happy to do this interview with you. In the part one of this interview, we were discussing some of the games that you were developing and where you got your inspiration from. Um, I want to go ahead and kind of jump straight into this interview and ask you roughly about 4 to 5 questions. Uh, and again, this is part two of two. So this will be the last interview that we do currently. Um, in the previous video, you were talking about some updates that were coming to one of your games in the Atari VCS, which was Pedra Crystal Caves. One of the other questions that I meant to ask earlier, and never really got around to, was will we perhaps see a release? I'm gonna give my cat a second, and we'll, uh,
Never work with children or animals, they say.
yeah, yeah, cut. Okay. So in the earlier interview that we did, you mentioned that one of your games on the VCS, Pedro Crystal Caves, was going to receive an update. One of the questions that I meant to ask actually in the previous interview and never really got around to was, will we perhaps see a release of the 2015 version of Pedro on the Atari VCS? Is that something that might be in the plans?
Uh, it wasn't until you mentioned it. I hadn't really thought about it because I thought I'd kind of moved on from that, and Crystal Caves was the version that I wanted out there. If there's some appetite for it, then that could be something I could revisit. As I'm reading the question and thinking about it, what's ticking through my mind is how I would actually go about doing that. So
Perhaps it
it
could be, sorry, but perhaps it could be like some bonus levels, so to
It,
speak.
it could well be. It could well be. There could be some special thing that unlocks it that you can play the original version. Yeah. That's anything is possible given enough time and effort, really. Yeah, that could be. I'm gonna put that in a little box, and maybe I'll revisit that at some point in the future. We'll yeah, to be revisited possibly in the future. Who knows? Who knows? It could happen.
Okay,
It
there
could.
you go.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm gonna mention a few of the games that you have developed before in the past for Android. And as I'm mentioning this, and as we're talking about these games, I'm also gonna have in one of these corners, Vogue, in one of these corners here, the gameplay is gonna play, so people have something to kind of resonate it with. But you had three particular games that were released on Android that I wanted to talk about real quick. One of those was Tower Slam, which
Mhm.
is a very actually, I'll let you explain Tower Slam, because you're the developer.
Well, Tail Slam was um again, it was an exercise in a particular game dynamic where you were firing these little I call them slam balls against rectangular blocks which are towers, and the idea is that you need to clear the little platform that these towers are standing on, which was inspired by a game called Boom Blocks on the Wii many years ago, if you're familiar with that.
I'm
Which
not.
is there's a lot more in the Wii version, obviously, and we're limited by what we can do on a phone screen. But it was I saw that and I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. I'd like to throw things at things and destroy them, which is very fun to do anyway, generally. And that was the idea behind Tower Slam. And Really, that was I developed it to the point where it was kind of like a prototype, and I was kind of happy enough with it. But then I kind of lost interest a little bit with it, and I come up with some other things that I moved on to. I recently went back to it a couple of months ago, and I thought this is actually kind of fun to play, and it could be something that I could sort of develop further into the future. So that could be something that could come onto the VCS at some point. Who knows? Yeah, yeah.
Um, One of the you mentioned that it might come to the VCS, and I think that's something very important to pick up on because you happen to have another game that I wouldn't say I was necessarily a fan of, but I definitely had fun playing. It's a very simple game, Tau Wars. Do you want to talk about that one real quick?
Yeah, that is a version of Reverse Eye or Go, which is a very, very old board game.
Mhm.
I think it has its origins in Japanese or Chinese culture, probably thousands of years ago. I'm not quite sure. But it's a very, very simplistic board game that people play even today. And I think there was a browser version of this that I saw many years ago. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. I hadn't really played it much. So I thought I'll have a go at coming up with something of my own my own flavor just to see what it would be like, you know. And so that's how Tile Wars came about, really. So yeah.
With it being a fairly common game, is there a chance of that being on the VCS as well? Maybe like at a discounted price or something for just people to pick up and enjoy, or maybe consider.
Yeah. I mean, it's again, it could be something that I had an idea about putting all of these sort of earlier games into kind of a one title party pack sort
Hmm.
of game. A bit like what you kind of get on the Nintendo consoles, where you've got multiple flavors of Mario and
Right,
whatever,
right, right.
and lots of mini games, you know.
WarioWare, I think, is what it's called.
Yeah, that's it. And so I thought maybe Tower Slam, Tile Wars, and possibly Roids, which we may come on to in a minute,
Oh
could
yeah.
all be packed in as a sort of a singular title, but with these sort of mini games. So that could be something that I could certainly put together. But again, it's all time, isn't it? So
Oh yeah.
it's something that could be done in the future. And you know, certainly when other people such as yourself take an interest in these things, it sort of inspires you to kind of think, well, yeah, maybe I'll do that, you know. So yeah, absolutely, yeah, could well be.
So you mentioned Roids, and I think that's going to be one of the most detailed ones that I give my opinions on. Um, I was not a fan. I have never screamed so much at a game before than
That's
Roids.
a good thing. That means you're invested in it. It's good.
So with like we've had a private conversation before where we're discussing like how the game functions and everything, where basically, you know, you can have the tilt function or you can do the swipe function, but no matter which function you choose, and I'll let you explain more on it, but no matter which function you choose, controlling that one block is just so infuriating. So infuriating. But go ahead. I'll let you talk about it.
Roids. Yeah, this is an infuriating game. Your words. And it's based on a very old Atari game. I forget the name now, but an original Atari game from Atari's heyday, where you are limited by the screen dimensions, and you're controlling a little block that you have to move around the screen and avoid little roids, which are little pixels that are basically trying to come and attack you, and you need to avoid them. And there's ways of defeating them by moving over little power blocks and things like this. And it slowly destroys your character. And when your character is basically completely destroyed, that's it, game over. Or you hit the side of the screen, and then it's game over as well.
That's the part
So
that gets me too, is because like,
yeah,
sorry,
and the control method is either there's a tilt, but again it's very gentle, you know, in all directions, or with your finger. And I appreciate it's difficult, but the aim of the game is to see how long you can last before you die, and that's it. So really, it's a very quick time kind of game. Yeah.
well, you did good. You did good. Give me that. But so with it being, and I'm also not familiar with which game you're referring to for the Atari either, for the Atari heyday either, but um, and I'm pretty sure some Atari enthusiasts are going to watch this video, especially with me
I'm
being.
sure they will, because I think it was a fairly well-known game back in the day. I misplaced the name now, but yeah.
I can just see it now. There's just some guy sitting there, and he's like, "Oh, you got it wrong," you know. But would you implement it to perhaps the classic controller?
Uh, yeah. I mean, especially with the twist paddle on that, I think that could work. Yeah. It might be better with a modern controller with a thumbstick. That might be easier to control. I don't know.
True.
But it's something to look at. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next question here, and this is probably the I know that you'll probably be able to be limited on speaking about this game, but one of your most anticipated games as of late has been Guardian Wars, which I want to make a few statements on real quick before we continue. But it, and correct me if I'm wrong, this was inspired by Sentinel on the Atari ST, correct?
Yeah.
But I do believe that you had mentioned before that there were some issues that you can't really talk about. But um, are you able to tell us anything at all about that game or about its development, maybe its release, maybe its inspirations? You know, what made you want to create such a game like this? What can you tell us about it?
Okay, so yes, you're right that it's basically my take on Jeff Cramman's The Sentinel
Mhm.
from back in the 80s. You said the Atari ST, but it came out on 8 bits as well, so the Commodore 64. and others. But I guess a lot of people would know it from the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga days.
Hmm.
When it first came out, and I first saw it on the Commodore 64, and I think then the Amiga, I thought, nah, not really for me. It's one of those really complicated thinking games that there's just not much happening. I like things that are exploding and blowing up and shooting and all of this. So then, I forgot about it. Years later, I saw a. Oh, can you hear that, by the way?
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay. Years later, I came across a remake on the internet. Somebody had developed a one level version of this with updated graphics and all of this. And I think it was it called Sentinel Returns or something. But anyway, some guy developed it.
That sounds
Uh,
familiar. Sorry,
Although
that's
that might be the official. I know Psygnosis did another version for
yeah,
PlayStation. I think PlayStation 1, I think it was.
yeah, because there
But
was a
anyway,
demo. I'm so sorry.
yeah. But there was a basically somebody had done a version. It was just on a browser, like on some website somewhere, and it was a single level version of it. And I had to play around. I thought, oh, I remember that. That's why I had to play with it. And I was like, oh, this is actually quite interesting. This is now somebody who had gone from being, a little snotty nosed kid who plays shoot 'em ups to, somebody who has developed into somebody who has a bit more patience with things and a bit more world life experience. So I could actually appreciate the way that the game worked. And I thought, that's interesting. So then I went back to the original and I found a version that I could have a play around with. And like a lot of the games that I've worked on, they were mental exercises in trying to figure things out. So I thought, right, I'm going to have a go to see how I could create something similar, just as purely as a programming exercise. Creating the landscapes, and then creating the actual Sentinel himself, and you as the player, you can teleport and create the rocks and the trees and the whole mechanics of how the game worked.
Mhm.
I started to implement a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, a little bit more, until before I knew it, there was pretty much a fully fledged game in there. But then fast forward a little bit into fairly recently, and I did put it on the Discord server a few screenshots of it,
Mhm.
and with the potential of releasing it on the VCS, and there were some positive and negative reactions to it. Uh, and I started to have some discussions with Jeff Crammond about releasing it,
Mhm.
and he's more than willing to grant a license to release. The problem is it's a financial obligation on my part,
Mhm.
and it's just something that I simply can't afford to do.
Right.
So, and that's absolutely fair enough. It's his IP. I wouldn't want to release something that goes against any kind of legal issues. So, in that sense, as a paying game, until or and when I could resolve those contractual issues, then it won't be released, unfortunately. And it would essentially stay as a developmental exercise on my part, which was thoroughly satisfying. And I got a lot out of it in terms of trying to figure out how the game worked. And hats off to Mr. Crammond in terms of trying to cram all that into 64K or even half a megabyte back in the day on an Amiga
Right.
or Atari ST. It's unbelievable how we managed to do all of that.
And
So yeah.
that actually raises a question here. One of the coolest things about the VCS is that let's say, for example, that you transfer the video games to an SD card, right? You have to format it exclusively for the VCS. I've tried plugging the SD cards, into like my computers and stuff to try to look at the content. You can't view the SD card unless you export it, which so being able to protect those video games, I feel like the VCS is definitely doing their part to help against piracy, which is wonderful. And I'm pretty sure there's other ways that you can view the content, but for those who are less tech savvy, it's going to be incredibly difficult. With that in mind, how do you feel about your games being on the VCS? Do you feel comfortable like they're protected? Do you feel like they're doing their part? Is there something they can maybe do more of that would make you feel at ease or other people feel at ease? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, piracy's always been an issue since the very early days,
Right.
and no matter how much protection you put in, somebody somewhere will get around it. It's always been an issue, and I guess it always will be.
Mhm.
Um, consoles, I guess, are a little bit different in that sense that the hardware is a little bit more locked down than, say, a PC.
Hmm.
And there are, things they can do with plugging in, thumb drives and what have you. I haven't really explored that too much, so I only really look at it from a Windows point of view, from a development laptop sort of point of view. But if they are, they obviously should be concerned about things like piracy. But I think certainly the people who are using the VCS at this point, and again, it goes back to the point of it hasn't reached critical mass yet in
Right.
terms of the population, that something like piracy would be a major issue because the people who are buying the VCS are decent and honest people, and they're purchasing it and the games that go with it to
Right.
support the ecosystem,
Right.
which is good. A lot of times when these systems do become mass market, then you get people who want to cut the corners and get things for free. It's inevitable. It's human nature.
Right.
So there's very little that I think I could certainly do to sort of combat that. I mean, back in the day, there was all sorts of weird and wonderful anti-piracy measures put in place. But I think that's certainly something that Atari ought to think about as and when things become a bit more mass market. They probably already have, and there's probably stuff technology-wise in there that combat it already. Purely the fact that it's not sort of a physical game that you're connecting into the VCS. It's all downloaded through the store. That's all controlled at their end. So in that sense, there is an element of piracy protection, I guess. But yeah, who knows what's going to happen in the future? It could things could change, and that's certainly something we'd have to look at.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. Right now, I definitely think that Atari is doing it right. And I hope that in the near future that they can get the recognition that they deserve. And I'm saying this as a fan and somebody who's had it since the launch. I don't have any complaints with the BCS. I mean, is it perfect? Perhaps not, but it meets my needs. It meets my requirements, and I'm happy to be a part of the community. And I'm happy to advocate for it any way that I can. But more importantly, advocating for the independent developer. I think that's the bigger thing here. Atari will always be Atari. Like they'll always have that name, so to speak. Um, 1 second, had a pop up on my end. Um, so we're at the 10-minute mark. We're about to run out of time, so we're going to wrap this interview up. And with that in mind, I want to take a minute to see if you could, in a few words or less, kind of recap, like what do you want viewers of this interview to take away from it? As far as developing, bringing new games, like what can they look out for? What's something that they can, link to your website or your Instagram, your Facebook, anywhere that they can contact you about what you're doing for the Atari VCS.
Yeah, so well, generally support the platform. There's lots of guys out there like me that are developing software. And if you're on the Discord server, you'll probably see them comment here and there. Support the other developers, support their game development because, like I said before, the platform lives and dies by its content. And if nobody's buying the content, it's going to die. So certainly support the other developers. um, I hope. I mean, I'm one of them. Pedra is a fairly cheap game to buy. It's not gonna make me a millionaire by any way, shape, or form. But if people like what I do enough, then that will inspire me to do more. Which is something that I would love to do. And you can follow what I do at tukasoft.com. Have a look there. I do have a Facebook page, but it's very, very old. I've not updated it in a long time. But there's various things I need to get back onto. But generally, yeah, keep buying Atari and keep buying the games. That's just what's going to keep us producing more. And that's it, really.
All right. Well, Ian, I wanted to say thank you so much for allowing me to interview you and having this, very lucrative conversation with you, if you will. I'm honored, I'm flattered, and I very much appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah.
And for
Thank
those of
you.
you guys who are watching, I'm Kaz Denzon with Crash Productions. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you check out part one. I'll put the link in the description below. And make sure you give Ian a follow because he deserves it. All right. I'm going to hit stop on the record.
Okay.